So that broadcast is going now. It says Hangout
Okay.
Air on live for me.
Okay.
Uh, and yeah, I'm still trying to work out of the butterflies because I always get nasty butterflies when I'm talking to somebody I wanted to talk to. Um, and just thinking, I'm sorry.
That's fine. We got time.
All right. Deep breath. Breathe in the good thoughts. Breathe out the bullshit. That's about the only bit of yoga I know, and I don't think it's actually yoga. All right. Well, this is Maddie Love. I am with Atheist Talk, and I'm happy to be joined by Greta Christina. We are doing a promo video for Secular Women Work Conference coming up. And Greta, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Happy to be here.
So we have just a couple questions we wanted to get through, kind of so you can talk more about what's going on. So almost everybody knows you, which is fantastic. But I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is, can you tell us how you got involved in like movement activism for secular activism?
When I first started to become an atheist, and when I first came out as an atheist, a lot of the world that I came out into, and that in fact inspired me to be an atheist, was the atheist blogosphere. And I was already blogging, so of course, blogging about my atheism was a natural step once I decided that I was an atheist. And that was my entrance, was the atheist blogosphere. And I was reading a lot of atheist blogs that were very inspiring to me. I was very inspired by this community that not only didn't believe in God, but that had these values that I shared. Valuing valuing reality, valuing truth, valuing being willing to change your mind. And now, of course, as many of us have learned, the community is not always as, great about these values as it should be. We sometimes, we love to yell at religious believers for, not being sufficiently rigorous in their thinking, and then when it comes to our own biases and beliefs, we don't always live up to our ideals. But the ideals are worth living up to, and I really wanted to be part of a community that lived up to those values, and so that was my first participation in movement atheism really was with the online community, and to a great extent it still is my sort of my foundation. Many of the people that I'm closest to, that I work most closely with in movement atheism, are people who I primarily know online. And yeah, and I think online activism is really important. It's a lot of how we live in an online world. We live in an internet world right now, and that's how people know each other. It's how people organize. It's how people connect. It's how people spread the word about things. So yeah, so that was my entree.
Well, and when we talk about like secular activism and atheist activism and stuff, I was reading your book From the Way of the Heathen, and one of the parts I liked, you just talked about how some atheists say that atheism simply means lack of belief in any gods,
Mhm.
but that you talk about how that conclusion has implications, like that there's a vacuum that's left out. Like if we're not putting the responsibility on God to make the world a better place,
Mhm.
that onus for responsibility is, you say, rests squarely on our shoulders.
Mhm.
And I feel like that voice is a really strong one to counter some of the atheists that I hear, especially loud online on YouTube right now, who are very like anti any kind of social justice, or very
Mhm.
anti any secular, like basically all the stuff that secular women work is pushing for.
Mhm.
It seems like there's a lot of anti that right now online. Is that?
There is a lot of that. There's always been a lot of that for for many years. I don't know about always, but for many years, there's been that thread in secularism of atheism doesn't mean anything other than atheism. It doesn't mean anything other than not believing in God. It doesn't have any other meaning it doesn't have any other implications. There's no culture, there's no community, there's no movement, which is, for one thing, silly. It's just a flat denial of reality. There is a movement, there are communities, and you can say that you don't like those things, but the reality is that they exist. But it's also really, is hypocritical too strong a word? No, hypocritical is not too strong a word, because if atheism doesn't have any implications, if all it means is not believing in God, why are you doing YouTube videos? What reason is there to do anything about atheism if it doesn't, what reason is there to talk about it? What reason is there, people who say, oh, atheism, it doesn't imply anything about social justice or how we live in the world. Well, so atheism also doesn't necessarily imply activism about church-state separation. It doesn't automatically imply, even coming out as an atheist. And yet, people are doing these things. So people who really care a lot about, oh no, there's 10 Commandments monuments in city halls, which I agree is a bad thing. But that's activism implied by atheism. You've come to this conclusion that there are no gods, and that has some conclusions, including the conclusion that government should not be in the business of telling people what religion to believe in. So for me, it has and for many other people, it has other conclusions as well. It has, very importantly, the conclusion that this life is the only life we have, and therefore it is up to human beings to make that life better for ourselves and for other people. And that's where social justice comes in. And, if you don't like using the word atheism to mean that, fine. I don't actually care a whole lot what language people use to describe their non-belief and the life that they lead and the activities and activism that they take, inspired by that non-belief. If you want to call that humanism, if you want to call it skepticism, if you want to call it secularism, free thought, whatever. I really have no opinion about what language you use to describe your non-belief and the life you lead because of that non-belief. I just want people to respect that, this language is flexible. The language is fluid. Language is always fluid. Identity language is especially fluid. And in particular, identity language for marginalized people, the language that, for instance, LGBTQIA people have used over the decades to describe ourselves. That language has changed. It's been different in different subsets of those communities and of that movement. Because it is very personal. And, when you've been told your whole life that who you are is bad, that being a woman is bad, that being Black is bad, that being queer is bad, that being a non-believer is bad. And when the language that you use has been when the language around these identities has been defined by the dominant culture, which it, generally is, being able to choose your own language and being able to say, this is what this language means to me, is hugely important. It's hugely empowering, and it's distressing to me to see non-believers try to take that power away from each other and try to insist, this is what these words mean to me, and therefore this is what they should mean to everybody else. And so definitely for me, and for many other people, non-belief, it's not like, okay, well, there's no God, so that's the end of it. It is a conclusion that has implications. And among those implications are that justice is not going to be created in the afterlife. It's not going to be created by some all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being. We have to create it. There's a saying that, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. The arc of history does not bend towards justice unless we push it. And that is very much that conclusion and that way of living is very much inspired by my non-belief.
Yeah, you were talking about death and the afterlife, and that got me thinking. I was reading your book last night, and I'm sorry, just blanking on the name. How atheists deal with death.
The death one is called "Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God."
Yes. So I was reading that, and I wrote down one of these, or made a note because I wanted to talk to you about it. I thought it was a great segue for your activism, and it was how you're trying to like make the world a better and safer place for atheists too. And I see that, like, emotionally, psychologically, for people that aren't atheists yet but are thinking about it, and how if we do this activism work and we create a not necessarily a safe space for everyone, because not everybody needs a safe space, but if we make sure there are safe spaces for the people that need them, um, I see that as just as really powerful activism. And I guess I wanted to use that to segue, like, what is your favorite part of activism that you're doing now, or the part that's speaking to you the most?
So I am co-founder and co-organizer of a local community in San Francisco called Godless Perverts. I co-founded it with my friend and colleague Chris Hall, and it's a community that exists to promote a positive view of sex without religion. And the sort of the three pillars of the organization are atheism, secularism, etc., skepticism, science, and so on, sex, sexuality, gender, and social justice, because, those are very much tied together. And I haven't done a whole lot of community organizing before this. And so it was, I've mostly done online organizing, online activism. I've done, participated in sort of other people's organizations a fair amount. And of course I've done, a lot of writing, and which is a form of activism in itself, or it can be. But this sort of actually on the ground doing local community organizing has been very new to me. It's something I've really had to learn on the ground. And it's really exciting for me because it's hard to put into words why exactly it's exciting. I think because it is on the ground. And I've always been in awe of people who do local community organizing, because it's kind of thankless work. It's, when people talk about their heroes in atheism, they tend to talk about the celebrities. They talk about, I don't want to get into
the Greta Christinas.
Yeah. Actually, I was thinking about the asshole atheist celebrities, but there's a lot of atheist celebrities who are less than awesome, but to me, the real heroes of this movement are people who are doing on the ground work, providing support for non-believers, providing a structure for non-believers to do good work in the world, to do activism, to do charity work, and just to support each other and take care of each other. And a lot of it is just very nitty gritty. It's not exciting, not glamorous, but it's really meaningful for people. And when you multiply it by however many hundreds or thousands of local groups there are around the country and around the world, it's hugely important, and especially because right now, a lot of social justice atheists have lost a lot of faith, small f faith, have lost a lot of faith in the big national organizations. A lot of the big national organizations have been very disappointing. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think that where the real hope is for the future of this movement right now is largely in in the local groups, because the local groups is where you as an individual have a lot more power to have your voice heard and to have an impact. You know, if you're one of however many thousands of members of a big national organization, you know, you need to get a lot of you together before you can really make a dent on what the national organization does. If you're involved in a local community, you have a lot with, like, you know, 50 people, 100 people, you know, even 1,000 people. You have a lot more power to affect what that community is going to do. And there's also just something really delightful about just really seeing in person, seeing people's faces when you put on an event, and they are, whether that's, you know, we do stuff that's, you know, we do like big educational events. You know, we did an activist protester safety training a couple of months ago when the Nazis were in San Francisco and a lot of people were protesting. We did a panel discussion with people who had been in ACT UP on sort of the history of ACT UP and how that affects resistance work today, you know, what people today can learn from it. And we also have game nights, you know, and we have social clubs where and sometimes the social clubs are on deep burning issues of the day, and sometimes we're just kind of shooting the breeze about whatever, you know, we're watching on TV. And all of that is important. All of it is important community building. All of it is important activism. And there has been, as much as I've really had to like learn while I go about in-person community organizing, there is really something about that personal connection, that in the flesh connection with the people that you're working to organize and that you're working to support.
No, I can't agree more. Like, we are so lucky, like here in Minnesota. It sounds like you guys have a great network in San Francisco as well. But here as Minnesota atheists, that we're big enough that we can, I feel like, impact the community, but small enough that individual members have an opportunity to affect the change that you're talking about. And, you know, you were talking about losing faith in a lot of the major organizations. Like, for a time, I've considered rebranding my personal podcast from being an atheist podcast to being something else. Not because I've changed any belief set that I have, but because I'm getting so disaffected with what the term atheist is seeming to mean to more and more people, while also recognizing that it's an important term that I hang on to because it's a term that everybody understands. Even if they have different opinions on what the term means, like they know when I say, "Hey, I'm an atheist podcast," that at least I don't believe in God, and you know, I'm doing secular kind of talking points.
Yeah, and I don't want the jerks to take the word. I don't want them to get to own it. You know, there are a lot of jerks in atheism and organized atheism and atheist communities. You know, certainly in online atheism. You know, there's a lot of jerks. You know, a lot of people who are, I don't know. I don't want this to be about the jerks, but but I don't want them to get to claim the word atheism. I think it is a powerful word. It is a word, as you say, that most people recognize. And yeah, and they don't get to own it. And so there is this. I mean, where the Godless Perverts is, I think, a much smaller group than Minnesota atheists. But you know, but yeah, there is this power in this, you know, in the in-person work. And oh, there was something else I was going to say about that. What was it? We're editing this, right? So you can edit out the parts where I'm wandering on.
I really hope Stephanie's going to edit.
Okay. Oh, I know what it was. So Godless Perverts for quite some time was primarily, we did social support, and we also did these performance events. You know, we had you know, people who would do reading, spoken word, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, that was about the intersection of sex and atheism and religion and science. And, you know, so it was not, excuse me. I mean, that in itself is a form of activism, But when the election happened, when the disaster of November 2016 happened, our very first meetup afterwards was about uh, doing resistance work. And it was by a long shot our best attended social club. And people were really ready. The people in our community, who've mostly been showing up to, chat about, religion and pop culture and to play games. And sometimes, we have some, more serious discussions at times too, and very social justice oriented discussions. But mostly what we had been doing up to that point had been these performance events and hanging out. And the people were ready. The people in Godless Perverts were really ready to do more action and to take more steps. And we have been doing more of that. We're actually going to be the March for Our Lives on March 24th. Godless Perverts is going to have a presence. We had a presence at the Women's March. Not huge. We're not a huge organization, but we're showing up. And a number of us showed up at the counter protest when the Nazis came to San Francisco, and also when we've been doing a fair amount of education on how to do activism and how to do resistance work that people have been taking into their own lives, and that has been really inspiring. I think when Chris and I first started to do this, we weren't sure if people were going to be like, yeah, we really want to do resistance work, or like, no, we really need, this is not what we want from this. This is our break from that. We want to play games and chat about television. And I have actually been really inspired by how much our community has been like, yes, things are absolutely not okay with the world. The world is really broken right now. And it is up to us to fix it because, again, nobody else is going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no God to fix it, and you can't really trust the people that do believe in God to fix it,
yeah,
because
yeah.
I don't want them to fix it the way they're trying to fix it.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
kind of, it's up to us, and
Yeah.
that's both awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, I think.
Yeah.
When I left religion, it was like the biggest feeling of happiness that I got when I realized that I didn't have to worry about hell and nobody was looking over my shoulder. It was also kind of terrifying to think, wait a minute, I'm standing on an onion skin of a planet, hurtling through space, and it's my job to leave this place a little bit better than when I found it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of terrifying, but it was also kind of really awesome at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking going back to your The Way of the Heathen, there was a passage in there that reminded me of Secular Women Work Conference. You were talking about, I guess I want to know, how would you respond to critics who would argue, yes, but, when we're talking about religions that are expecting women to do unpaid labor, or just culture that expects women to do unpaid labor? When they respond that, no, it was the way I was raised, or, hey, we had a need and a woman stepped into it to fill it, so what's the problem? Like, how do you respond to that? Like, where does your activism lie in that role?
And I'm not sure how to respond to that because those arguments are often very, unsatisfying. But it can be very hard for people to accept, and I will put myself in this. It can be very hard for us to accept that we don't always know why we do the things that we do. That we are very much shaped by the culture we were raised in, that we're shaped by, if you're raised in a sexist culture, if we're raised in a racist culture, which of course we all are, raised in a transphobic culture, a queerphobic culture, classist culture, ableist culture, and so on, in ways that we're not even aware of, that shapes us, that shapes how we think, and it shapes what we do. And that can be a very hard thing to hear, because I don't know why it's hard to hear, because it's basically people telling you you're not in control of yourself and your life. But the way that I frame that for myself is what I have control over is what I choose to do about that. I can choose to ignore the mountain of evidence. I can be a really bad skeptic and a really bad rationalist and ignore the mountains and mountains and mountains of evidence that exists about how much we are unconsciously affected by biases that we've learned. Um, or I can choose to learn about them, and I can choose to take action on them. I can choose to try to make myself better. I can choose to recognize, hey, reality exists. This is what the reality is. So what am I going to do about that? And learn about my own biases and learn about them so that I can work to overcome them, so that I can work to become a better person. Um, and so, yeah, so, I mean, it's especially frustrating when skeptics say, oh, no, I'm not shaped by, somehow I have miraculously, unlike every other human being on the face of the planet, I have somehow miraculously escaped being influenced by society around me. I'm not a social animal in any way, shape, or form. Um, and, but denying that is ridiculous. It's flatly absurd. It goes against common sense, and it goes against, again, mountains of evidence. Um, so I think that the socially responsible thing to do, and also the good skeptical thing to do, the rational thing to do, is to recognize that we have these biases, and that even without intending it. And I think that that's part of it, is that people feel blamed. When you say, hey, you're acting in ways that are sexist or racist or classist, and you're hurting people because of it, they feel blamed. And what I think is really important is that responsibility isn't the same thing as blame. Being responsible for something isn't the same as it's your fault. We're not at fault for having learned bad ideas, but the minute that we say, I'm not going to take responsibility for that, the minute that we deny evidence, the minute that we deny the reality of our biases, then it is our fault. That's when we're to blame. When we take responsibility and say, this, of course I have biases, exist in a biased world, that's the responsible thing to do. And that's when it's something I talk about a little bit in The Way of the Heathen, is that there's a couple of different ways to think of yourself as being a good person. You can say, well, I'm a good person, therefore everything I do is good, and therefore anybody who tells me I'm doing something wrong is a jerk, and they're being mean. And or you can recognize that you aren't always good. We can recognize that we are not always good people, and and we can question our motives, and we can question what we do, and and that, I think, is a more powerful way of being a good person, is is acknowledging the reality that evil is not that thing out there. It's not some force out in the world that shapes us. It's a capacity that we all have, and that we all have to fight every day.
Yeah, I don't think any one of us are above messing up, if nothing else. I mean, we're all a
No,
product of our environment to some extent.
yeah.
No, I really liked the way you said that. Uh, so I totally lost what I was going to say. I'm terrible at this, I think.
You're not terrible at this. It's conversation. That's how conversations work. They go in different directions, and you lose the thread.
Well, but I'm supposed to be directing this like in a certain way, but at the same time, I'm just like, God, I really just want to like listen to you talk for a really long time.
Well, let's you and I do a podcast sometime. I would love to do a podcast do an interview for your podcast as well as this. So,
well, yeah, and the best part about my podcast is it's a true podcast. So, like, if we have a complete brain fart, I edit it out, and you just still sound like super on point, and like your train never left the tracks. I delete out any ums, you knows, and ahs to a point, because you want to keep it semi-real. But I going back to Way of the Heathen, is one of my favorite of your books, I guess. That and the Death Book, because I used to work in a coroner's office, and so that one really talked to me on a professional level too. But going back to Way of the Heathen, you talk about how many organizations have fought hard for LGBT or LGB rights, or for LGBT rights, well, LGB rights anyway. But I'm just wondering, what is the one thing that you want people to learn about secular activism? If you had to pick one thing.
there's too many things. There's so many things. So
Well, you don't have to narrow it down to one.
okay,
I mean, it's
okay,
just,
no,
it could be more than one.
um, so do you mean secularists or do you mean non-secularists? Because I think those
Uh,
are different questions.
yeah, that's a good point. I would say focusing on the secular activism, because
Okay.
you're right, there's a lot of social justice activism that
Mhm.
we can't ignore, and there's a lot of overlap between the two as well. But
Sure,
just
sure.
focusing on secular activism,
Mhm.
something that we could all get behind,
Mhm.
or that we should all learn.
Right. Um, I think that the thing that I really want secularists to remember, and this includes myself because we all forget this, is that knowing about cognitive biases does not free us from them. And and I think secularists and skeptics uh, tend to use, we know about all these cognitive biases and we know about all these like bad ways of arguing that religious believers often engage in when they talk with us about religion. And we know about all these, rational errors and so on. And I think too often we use those to make ourselves feel better than religious believers, as opposed to a guide for us to become better ourselves. And we've seen this a lot around the way a lot of the bad ways that a lot of secularists have responded to the Me Too movement and to claims and accusations and reports of um, sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, sexual assault. Um, that every single cognitive bias and rational error that we decry among religious believers defending religion, I've seen secularists use to uh, to defend sexual assailants and to deny the reality of sexual assault in our community. And so that's, I think, the one of the things that I really want us to do better at is, and it applies to a lot of things. It applies to, um, it applies to our own racism. It applies to our own classism. It applies to things that aren't even about social justice necessarily. Um, you know, Knowing about cognitive biases and rational errors does not make us immune to it, and we have the responsibility to be vigilant about them in ourselves and not just to point the finger at religious and spiritual believers, and say, look how silly you are for moving the goalposts and demanding absurd and impossible levels of evidence, when we ourselves are doing the same thing.
Exactly the same thing. It was as somebody who's not really, I'm a part of the community, but I'm very much on the outside. It just appalled me. It's like, wait a minute, I've heard these arguments before. It's like, and they weren't very good then. They weren't convincing then. We made fun of them. We ridiculed how stupid they were. And
Mhm.
yet I hear the same ones coming from the smartest people in the organization or in the movement. And it's like,
Mhm.
oh, this is terrible. We are better than this. Let's prove it.
We are, we should be. Well, one of the things that's distressing about this to me is there is right now, as awful as things are in the United States, and they are really awful right now, um, there's also this really incredible resistance movement that's been rising up. And it happened almost immediately after the election. It's like, I feel like the first day or two after the election, everybody was just in shock. And then almost immediately, people started moving into what are we going to do about this? And people who had never been activists started stepping up, and taking action and organizing. And we're seeing the effects of it already. It's I am really excited for the 2018 elections. I mean, I don't think it's a shoe-in. We're going to have to do the work, but I am very excited to see what's going to be happening there. Um, what's distressing is that the secular, atheist, humanist, whatever you want to call it, movement, on paper, should have been one of the leading forces in this resistance movement, and we're not. Um, on paper, we are we've had a lot of media attention recently. We are a very young movement. That not a young movement in the sense that, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but a lot of us are young people. We are a very recently mobilized and energized and inspired movement. We should have been not at the forefront, but one of the leading lights. And we have a lot to say. We have a lot to give to resistance work and to progressive activism in general. There is a lot of bad thinking. There's a lot of woo. There's a lot of irrationality in progressivism. I'm the first to acknowledge that. And we have a lot to give, but we're not. And I think a lot of the reason that we're not is that there are so many people in secularism who are just adamantly opposed, to the point of, just trying to, and successfully in some cases, harassing and haranguing people out of movement. The number of people who have just left organized atheism or taken a big step back from it, because they got, harassed and threatened by, haters. It's very distressing. And there's also, and it's not just the extreme haters. There's the people who are defending them, who are rationalizing them, who are trivializing it, who are saying, oh, well, both sides are equally bad, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of people in this movement the people in secularism who are inspired by resistance work, a lot of us are very demoralized. And a lot of us are doing our resistance work not under the banner of secularism. We're joining other organizations to do it. And I think that's a hugely lost opportunity for us to make ourselves relevant and to make progressivism more rational and more free of cognitive bias. So yeah, it's like, we really have to clean up our own house before we're able to do that work.
Yeah, it's actually, I am a recent joiner of the Satanic Temple, and that is actually one of the reasons why I joined. It's like, well, I didn't have to change any of my beliefs about atheism. I didn't have to change any of my beliefs about social justice or being a progressive. I simply am relabeling myself more or less while still identifying most of the time as an atheist, because it's not worth picking a fight when I say I'm a Satanist. Yeah. So with all of that, what are you most excited for about this upcoming Secular Women's Conference?
I am really excited to learn more about activism and organizing from people who have been doing it longer than I have. Again, I'm relatively new to this on the ground community organizing. There's a lot that I don't know about it. And there's people who have been doing it for much longer than I have and who really know about it, who know about the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of it, who know about the big picture of it. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about it. And I'm also just looking forward to being inspired by these people. Again, it's organized atheism can be very demoralizing for social justice activists. But every time I go to one of these conferences that is social justice focused, when I've been to Skepticon, when I've been to the Secular Social Justice Conference, I leave feeling energized, feeling newly motivated to do this work. And, and with specific ideas, but also just with inspiration. And that's a lot of what I'm looking forward to, is just being around the people who share my values and who inspire me.
All right. Well, the Secular Women Work Conference is August 24th through the 26th. Probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. The Kickstarter officially ends on March 29th. I would encourage anybody who's watching this or who is listening to this, because I think it'd be awesome if we stripped the audio and made it a podcast, to go ahead and make sure you buy your tickets in advance. thank you so much for chatting with me today, Greta. Is there anything that we missed that you wish we would have talked about?
Not today. Again, I would love to do this again on your own podcast. So let's make that happen.
That would be
But
totally
yeah,
awesome.
I think we covered a lot of it.
And yeah, that would be like, because I know we've had you on Atheists Talk like
Mhm.
3 or 4 times. I just finished transcribing 445 episodes worth of titles and moving stuff. So like I know who we've had, who I regret that we've had. Like I was like, ew, we've had them, or usually him. Um, but yeah, that
I,
would be fantastic.
okay, let's do it.
All right.
All right,
Bye
take
bye.
care. Thanks so much. Bye.